Gen Z inherited a world where every single checkpoint of adulthood, moving out, buying a car, getting a house, starting a family, costs approximately twice what it cost your parents at the same age. While wages have grown at roughly one-third the speed of assets, that is not a vibe, that is not a generational attitude problem, that is arithmetic. And arithmetic does not care how hard you work. In 2023, the average age of a first-time home buyer in the United States hit 35 years old. In 1984, it was 29. That is 6 years of your life, 6 years of compounding, 6 years of equity building, 6 years of net worth acceleration. That got quietly deleted from the Gen Z timeline before most people in this generation even graduated high school. Millennials got blamed for buying avocado toast instead of houses. Gen Z will get blamed for something equally stupid, I'm sure. Maybe buying too many energy drinks. Maybe spending too much on video games. The narrative always finds a way to make the victim look lazy. But the numbers are not about avocado toast. The numbers are about a system that has been structurally repriced in a direction that benefits people who already own things at the expense of people who are trying to buy things for the first time. So here is the question nobody is asking cleanly. Is this a Gen Z failure, or is this a design feature? We're going to explain exactly how the adulthood pricing mechanism works and why it's getting progressively more hostile to anyone who starts from zero. The metaphor I want you to hold in your head for this entire video is an escalator. For most of the 20th century, adulthood was an escalator. You stepped on at 18 or 22, and the escalator moved you upward. You didn't have to sprint, you didn't have to hustle, you just had to step on and stay on. The escalator did the work. Wages went up, housing was affordable, a single income could support a family, retirement accounts accumulated quietly in the background. The escalator was slow, but it was reliable. At some point, and I'll tell you exactly when, somebody turned off the escalator, and then somebody else tilted the floor, and now the entire structure that used to carry people passively upward has become something you have to run up manually while it slides backward underneath your feet. And the people who got on before it broke are standing at the top, completely confused about why everyone below them looks so exhausted. That is the frame. Escalator. Remember it. Now let me show you the 4 mechanisms that broke it. The first mechanism is the most misunderstood. One, which is why I'm starting here. Most people think the housing problem is a supply problem. Build more houses, problem solved. And yes, supply matters, but that explanation misses something structurally important, which is that housing stopped being purely a consumption good and became an investment asset class at scale. And that single transition changed everything about how the market behaves. Think about what happens when a product is both something people need to live in and something investors use to store and grow wealth. You now have 2 completely separate demand curves fighting over the same inventory. First-time buyers are competing against institutional buyers, landlords, REITs, foreign capital, and every homeowner who is sitting on equity and would like to see their number go up. The incentives of those 2 groups are directly opposed. The first-time buyer wants prices to fall or stay flat. Every other player in the market wants prices to rise. And guess which group has more capital, more political influence, and more leverage over zoning policy? In 2022, institutional investors own somewhere around 26% of single-family homes in major American metros. In some markets like Atlanta and Phoenix, it was higher. Now, I'm not blaming institutional investors for being rational actors. They looked at the same math everyone else looked at, and they concluded that single-family residential real estate was an appreciating asset with steady cash flow and tax advantages. That conclusion was correct. The problem is that when large pools of capital reach that conclusion simultaneously, ordinary buyers get structurally outcompeted before the bidding war even starts. A family with a conventional mortgage, a debt-to-income ratio check, a home inspection contingency, and 30 days to close cannot compete with a cash offer that waives inspection, closes in 7 days, and is backed by $1 billion fund. Not because the family lacks discipline, because the systems are not designed for equal competition. The escalator used to move everyone. Now it's a private elevator, and you need a key card. Here is the math that makes this concrete. The median U.S. home price in 2025 sits around $420,000. The median household income is somewhere around $78,000. That gives you a price-to-income ratio of roughly 5.4 to 1. In 1990, that ratio was closer to 3 to 1. Lenders typically want your purchase price to be no more than 3 to 4 times your gross income for the mortgage to be comfortably serviceable. Which means that by conventional lending standards, the median American family is now purchasing a house that is slightly too expensive for them every single year, structurally. Not because of bad decisions, because the median price outran the median income and nobody passed a law against it. And before you say, well, interest rates went up, it'll correct, the correction has not materialized in a meaningful way in most markets because the floor is held up by existing homeowners who will not sell into a declining market, by institutional holders who can afford to wait, and by a construction industry that has never fully recovered its labor supply from 2008. The escalator does not self-repair. The second mechanism is more subtle, and it operates on a longer timeline. It's the credential inflation trap. Here's the setup. Somewhere around the 1970s and 80s, a college degree became the economic equivalent of a high school diploma. In terms of signaling value, not in terms of cost, the diploma became necessary to access the same jobs that used to require a high school diploma, but the price tag of obtaining that diploma increased at roughly 8% per year, compounded for about 4 decades. That is not a typo. 8% compounded annually for 40 years. Meanwhile, the actual wage premium for a college degree, meaning the additional income you earn by having one versus not having one, has compressed as the supply of degree holders increased. Supply went up, value went down, cost went up. That is the worst possible combination of 3 variables, and it describes the current state of higher education economics almost exactly. The result is that an entire generation entered the labor market with an average of $37,000 in student loan debt, for a credential that the market values less than it used to, for jobs that pay in nominal terms about what those jobs paid 20 years ago, in a housing market that has roughly doubled or tripled in price since those salary benchmarks were established. To be fair, this is not entirely new. Millennials experienced a version of this. But there are 2 things that make the Gen Z situation structurally worse. First, the debt load is higher. Second, and more importantly, they graduated into a post-pandemic labor market where entry-level white-collar hiring has been quietly hollowing out as companies use AI to handle the analytical and administrative work that used to be done by 23-year-old analysts, making $55,000 a year. The jobs that used to be the bottom rung of the professional escalator are disappearing, and nobody is being particularly honest about what replaces them. Now, here's the thing that I think most people miss when they look at this. The credential inflation trap is not a mistake. It is a predictable output of a specific incentive structure. Universities are not primarily in the education business. They are in the credential business. A university's revenue is not tied to your employment outcome. It is tied to your enrollment. Their incentive is to maximize the number of students who believe a degree from their institution is worth attending, not to ensure that attendance produces economic returns. These are different goals. And when the goals diverge, the institution follows its own incentive, which is enrollment, not your outcome. That is not an attack on universities as institutions. That is just reading the incentive structure and reporting what you find. The escalator metaphor applies here too. The credential was supposed to be the ticket that gets you onto the escalator. For your parents, it was, you paid 3 years of tuition, you got on, the escalator did the rest. Now you pay 8 to 12 years of tuition because you included graduate school because the undergrad degree alone wasn't enough. And by the time you step on, the escalator is already tilted backward and you're starting from a negative position because you're carrying debt that accrues interest faster than your starting salary can service it comfortably. The third mechanism is the one that makes the math genuinely brutal, and it's the most overlooked. It's the compounding asymmetry between asset owners and income earners. Let me give you a simple scenario. 2 people, same age, same year. Person A's parents bought a house in 2002 for $240,000. By 2025, that house is worth $680,000. That is $440,000 of wealth gain that required exactly 0 additional labor from Person A's family. They just owned the thing. Person B's family rented their whole lives. They spent approximately the same amount of money on housing over 23 years. Because rent and mortgage payments are roughly comparable in many markets. But they have 0 equity at the end. 0. The money was exchanged for the right to occupy space and is now gone. Person A inherits the house, or receives help with a down payment, or benefits from their parents' financial stability in a dozen indirect ways. Person B starts from zero at 22, with student debt and a competitive rental market that is pricing them out of the neighborhoods with the best job access. This is not a moral argument. I'm not saying person A did anything wrong. I'm describing a compounding asymmetry. Asset ownership compounds. Renting does not. And the gap between those two compounding curves has widened dramatically because the assets have appreciated faster than the rate at which income earners can save enough to cross the threshold into asset ownership. In 2010, if you saved aggressively for 3 years out of college, you could potentially scrape together a down payment on a starter home in a mid-tier American city. In 2025, 3 years of aggressive saving in the same mid-tier city might not even cover the down payment, let alone the closing costs and the cash reserves the lender requires you to hold. The goalposts moved, and they moved because the asset appreciated while you were saving, so the target was always slightly further away than it appeared. This is the mechanism that most work harder advice completely fails to account for. You can increase the numerator, your savings rate, but if the denominator, the required down payment, is growing faster than your savings rate, you never close the gap. You run faster and the distance stays the same. That is not a character flaw. That is arithmetic again. If you've been watching this and thinking this is actually explaining something I felt but couldn't articulate, that's what this channel does. The subscribe button exists. Use it if you want to stay in the loop on how these systems actually work. The fourth mechanism is the one that surprises people the most, because it looks like good news on the surface. It's the gig economy and the freelance labor shift. Here is the surface level story. Technology gave workers freedom. You don't need to be chained to a desk anymore. You can work from anywhere. You can set your own hours. You can build multiple income streams. You can be your own boss. This is real. These things are true. But the second order effects of this shift are catastrophic for young people who are trying to do the traditional adulthood things. Because traditional adulthood requires paperwork, and paperwork requires stability. Try renting an apartment as a freelancer. A landlord looks at your income and immediately has a problem because your W-2 doesn't exist, your income is self-reported, it fluctuates. It doesn't come from a single employer who a bank can call to verify it. So the landlord asks for 12 months of bank statements, 3 months of tax returns, sometimes 2 years of tax returns, and a cosigner. And if you're 23 and your parents are renters themselves, you don't have a cosigner. You don't get the apartment. Now try getting a mortgage as a freelancer. Same problem amplified by a factor of about 10. Mortgage lenders use a 2-year average of your self-employment income after deductions. If you're young and building a freelance business, your income in year 1 and year 2 is probably lower than your current income, and your deductions are probably high because you were reinvesting in the business. So the bank calculates your qualifying income based on a number that is lower than your actual current earnings, and then tells you that you don't qualify for a loan that you could comfortably service at your current income level. The system was designed around stable, salary, W-2 employment. The labor market evolved away from that structure. The system did not evolve with it. The escalator still checks the same ticket from 1975, but the ticket office stopped printing that format. And here's the really cynical part. The companies that led the gig economy revolution explicitly structured their relationships with workers to avoid employment classification, because employment classification means payroll taxes, benefits, and obligations. They called workers independent contractors and sold it as flexibility and freedom, which it partially was, while simultaneously ensuring that those workers would not accumulate the employment history that the financial system requires for accessing credit, mortgages, and rental housing at normal terms. The freedom was real. The cost of that freedom in terms of financial system access was not prominently disclosed. Let me run a mini case study because this is where the abstract numbers become an actual human situation. Call her Maya. She's 24. She graduated 2 years ago from a mid-tier state school with a communications degree and $41,000 in student debt at a blended interest rate of 6.8%. Her minimum monthly payment is about $475. She got a job at a mid-sized marketing agency in a second-tier city, not New York, not San Francisco, but a city where the economy is decent and the housing market has been heating up for 4 years. She makes $52,000 per year before taxes. After federal and state taxes, her take-home is roughly $35,000 annually, or about $2,900 per month. Her rent for a one-bedroom apartment, split utilities, runs her $1,200 per month. Her student loan payment is $475. That is $1,675 in fixed monthly obligations before she has spent a single dollar on food, transportation, insurance, phone, clothes, or any discretionary expense. She has $1,225 left for everything else. Let's say she is exceptionally disciplined. She spends $400 on food, $150 on transportation, $100 on insurance and phone, $50 on MISC. She saves $525 per month. That is $6,300 per year. Now, a starter home in her city costs around $280,000. A conventional loan requires 3 to 5% down. At 3.5% FHA minimum, that is $9,800. But FHA also charges mortgage insurance, and the lender wants to see 3 to 6 months of cash reserves after the down payment. So realistically, she needs somewhere between $17,000 and $22,000 liquid to close. At $525 a month saved, she reaches that number in roughly 3 to 4 years. Except in those 3 to 4 years, the house she's saving for appreciates another 12 to 18%. Because the market in her city has been doing 6% annually. So the target moves from $280,000 to $310,000, and her required cash to close increases proportionally. She can see the house from where she is standing. She can almost touch it. But the house is on a conveyor belt moving away from her at roughly the same speed she's walking toward it. She is not failing, she is not lazy. She is experiencing a structural dynamic that her parents did not experience at the same age. Because when her parents were 24, that house cost $90,000 and the required savings horizon was measured in months, not years. The escalator didn't break for Maya's parents. It broke before Maya got on. Now, someone at this point in the video usually says something like, well, you just have to earn more, obviously, $52,000 isn't enough to buy a house. And they're not wrong. But notice what that argument actually is. It's an argument that only people above a certain income threshold deserve to access asset ownership. It's an argument that the asset class of housing should be progressively available to a smaller and smaller percentage of the population. If that's your position, own it explicitly. Don't dress it up as individual advice. Because the math of who can afford to buy in most major American markets has changed so dramatically that you're now talking about eliminating a majority of young earners from home ownership, not a fringe minority. In 1990, somewhere around 44% of households under 35 owned their home. By 2024, that number was closer to 28%. That is not a personal finance statistic. That is a structural shift in who has access to the main wealth-building mechanism in the American economy. And here is the second-order effect that almost nobody discusses. When a generation is locked out of asset ownership for longer, the compounding clock starts later. And because compounding is exponential, not linear, the years you miss at the beginning are not replaceable by working harder later. A dollar invested at 22 compounds for 43 years before retirement. A dollar invested at 35 compounds for 30 years. The difference in terminal value of those two identical dollars at 7% annual return is approximately a 2-to-1 ratio. You put the same dollar in at a different age and you end up with half the money. That is the invisible tax on being priced out of adulthood for an extra decade. Here's a quick illustrative moment. Imagine two people at a company orientation. One of them has a trust fund. The HR person says, "Great news, we have a 401k with employer matching." The trust fund person nods politely and goes home to a house their parents helped them buy. The other person nods and goes home to a rental apartment where their paycheck is already allocated to fixed costs with very little room for retirement contributions. Same job, same salary, same employer match available. Different ability to actually use the system. The 401k was designed as a democratic wealth building tool. It functions as a class accelerator. The thing that I think is genuinely new about the Gen Z situation, and I want to be precise here because this matters, is not that young people have always had it hard, which is true. It's not that previous generations face challenges, which is also true. It's that for the first time in the modern era, the standard life script of the middle class, graduate, get a job, rent briefly, buy a house, build equity, retire with some stability, is arithmetically out of reach for a significant majority of the generation attempting to follow it at any reasonable pace without inherited capital. That is new. Not hard, which has always been true. Arithmetically impossible by design, which is different. Let me tell you how the incentive structure maintains this situation even when people acknowledge it's a problem. Because this is the part that feels the darkest. Approximately 65% of American adults are homeowners. That means 65% of the voting population has a direct financial incentive in home prices remaining high or increasing. Their net worth is literally stored in that appreciation. When a politician proposes policies that would significantly increase housing supply, which would push prices down or slow appreciation, they are proposing to reduce the paper wealth of 65% of voters. That is not a winning electoral strategy. So it doesn't happen, not at the scale required. The incentives of the democratic system are aligned with asset owners, and asset owners want appreciation, and appreciation means affordability continues to decline for non-owners. This is not a conspiracy. Nobody is in a room plotting against young people. It is just the natural output of a political system that responds to the financial interests of its majority constituency. The majority constituency owns assets. They vote for policies that protect asset values. The result is a structural environment that systematically disadvantages people who do not yet own assets. The escalator was not sabotaged by a villain. It was just never maintained by anyone with a strong incentive to maintain it. Now let me give you the 3 things that actually matter here, because I don't want to end this video on a "here's why you're doomed" note. That would be useless. What I want to give you is an accurate map of the terrain so you can navigate it with better information than the standard narrative provides. The first thing is this: you cannot outdiscipline a structural misalignment, but you can change which game you are playing. The standard path, save up, buy starter home, trade up, retire, was optimized for a different economic environment. It still works, but it requires either higher income, geographic flexibility, or time horizons that most 20-year-olds aren't planning around. What actually works better in the current system is finding a way to own assets earlier, even small ones, even unconventional ones, and letting compounding start. That might mean house hacking, buying a duplex and renting 1 unit to cover your mortgage. That might mean geographic arbitrage, moving to a market where the price-to-income ratio is still manageable, which still exists in pockets of the country. That might mean starting with a small investment portfolio and building the habit of ownership before you can afford real estate. The mechanism is ownership. The specific asset matters less than getting the clock started. The second thing is understanding the credential trap before you enter it, not after. The degree to debt to income calculation should be run before you enroll, not after you graduate. If the expected starting salary of the career you're entering with a specific degree from a specific school does not support a comfortable student loan payment and a savings rate, the credential is mispriced for you. That is information. Use it. This might mean community college to 4-year transfer. It might mean trade school. It might mean a lower cost school. It might mean something else entirely, but everyone goes to college is no longer a sound default financial decision. It is a decision with a cost that must be modeled against an expected outcome. The third thing is the most important and the most counterintuitive. The people who actually exit the broken escalator dynamic are almost never the ones who worked harder on the escalator. They are the ones who found leverage. Leverage means getting paid for something beyond your direct hourly contribution. Whether that's a business that scales without you, a content platform, an investment that compounds, a skill that becomes a product. The reason this matters is mathematical. If your income is 1-to-1 with your labor, your wealth ceiling is defined by the number of hours in your day multiplied by your hourly rate. That ceiling is low relative to what assets can do. The people who close the gap fastest are the ones who add a second growth curve that does not require proportional additional work. That is not get-rich-quick advice, that is just the math of leverage. The escalator is broken. The people at the top of the broken escalator are not going to fix it, because they have no incentive to. The political system that could mandate repairs is owned by the demographic that benefits from the current state. That is the honest assessment. So the question is not when does someone fix the escalator, the question is how do you get to the top of the building anyway? And the answer is that some people build stairs not because they're more disciplined than you, not because they believed in themselves harder, because they understood the building's layout, found the stairwell, and started climbing before most people realized the escalator wasn't moving. That is what this whole video is actually about. Not grievance, not doom, A map the generation that figures out how to navigate this specific structural environment. Where assets are expensive, credentials are overpriced, traditional employment is fragmenting, and the financial system is still running on 1980 logic, is going to build wealth on a different architecture than their parents. Not the escalator, something they built themselves. Something that compounds, something that starts earlier and runs longer than the traditional path ever did. I'm not saying it's fair, I'm saying it's the terrain. And knowing the terrain is the beginning of navigation. If you want to keep getting clear maps of how this stuff actually works, subscribe. One video at a time. That's the whole thing.